He tasted salt and blood. The two had become indistinguishable. For years the sea had tried to claim him, to scour him from the world of men, and now, finally, it had thrown him back. He lay sprawled on a bed of sharp black pebbles, a piece of driftwood caught in the tatters of his tunic. His body was a road map of pain, each scar a memory, each ache a ghost. He pushed himself up, the gravel grinding into his palms. His hands, he stared at them. They didn't look like his own. They were the hands of a stranger, thicker, cracked, the knuckles swollen like old roots. These were not the hands of a king, a husband, a father. They were the hands of a survivor. He blinked, the harsh light of the sun fracturing in his vision. Before him, the wine-dark sea stretched to an indifferent horizon. Behind him, an island rose, cloaked in the silver green of olive trees. A scent reached him, carried on the breeze. Wood smoke, thyme, a smell so profoundly familiar it buckled his knees. He had forgotten what home smelled like. He stumbled to his feet, a low sound escaping his throat, something between a sob and a prayer. And he whispered a name, not to the sky or the sea, but to the very soil beneath his feet. A name that had been his anchor in a world of chaos. Penelope. This was not the triumphant hero of the songs. There were no cheering crowds, no divine patrons. There was only a broken man on a lonely shore, 20 years a ghost, returned to a world that had long since learned to live without him. This is the story of that man, not the legend written in poems, but the man of flesh and blood who sailed off the edge of the known world and had to find his way back through the dark. Part 1. A world of bronze and sunlight. Imagine a world before the darkness fell, before the palaces burned and the letters were forgotten. Imagine the late Bronze Age, around the year 1200 BC. The Mediterranean is a highway, not a barrier. Great ships with high curving prows carry copper from Cyprus, tin from the far west, amber from the north, and fragrant oils from Egypt. Power is measured in bronze, bronze swords, bronze spearheads, bronze armor that shines like the sun. And power resides in the great citadels. In Mycenae, a fortress so massive that later generations would say it was built by giants, the Cyclopes. Its lion gate stands guard over a kingdom of staggering wealth. In Pylos, scribes sit in cool, dark rooms, scratching lists into wet clay tablets, inventories of wine jars, chariot wheels, and tribute owed to the king, the great One-Axe. This is a world of rigid order, of palaces and kings, of gods who demand sacrifice and subjects who pay their dues. And far to the west, in the shimmering Ionian Sea, lies a small island, a rugged spine of mountain plunging into the water, its slopes terraced with olive groves and small fields of barley. This is Ithaca. It is not Mycenae, it is not Pylos. It is a minor chiefdom, one of many that owe allegiance and taxes to the great kings on the mainland. Here, on a commanding hill in the north of the island, at a place we now call Agios Athanasios, stands the home of its ruler. It's not a grand palace. Call it a hall, a chieftain's hall, built in the Mycenaean style they all emulated. A central room, the Megaron, where a great fire burns in a circular hearth, its smoke rising through an opening in the roof, staining the rafters black. 4 strong pillars hold up the ceiling. This is the heart of the community. Here, disputes are settled, feasts are held, and the island's wealth is stored. In the storerooms, massive clay jars, called pithoi, are filled with olive oil and wine. In the surrounding workshops, artisans craft pottery and repair tools. Deep beneath the earth, a marvel of engineering for such a small outpost. A hidden cistern lined with corbelled stone, ensuring a supply of fresh water even in the driest summer. This is a well-run, practical, prosperous place, and its master is a man named Odysseus. Don't picture the hero of the epics just yet. Picture the man. He is perhaps in his late 20s, not the tallest or the strongest of the Achaean kings. His strength is not in his spear arm, but behind his eyes. He is a talker, a negotiator, a planner. He can read a man's ambition in the shift of his gaze, and he knows the value of a well-placed word. He manages his estate, his oikos, with a careful hand. He knows every family, every olive grove, every goat herd on his island. His people are not his subjects. They are his household, and he is their chief, their onax. His wife, Penelope, is his match. She is not a passive queen waiting in the wings. In this world, the oikos is a complex business, and she is its co-manager. She oversees the weaving, the food stores, the servants. Her intelligence is as sharp as his, her will as strong. They are a partnership, the twin pillars of their small, stable world. And they have a son, a newborn, Telemachus, a child who knows only the warmth of the hearth and the smell of the sea. Life is good. It is predictable. The seasons turn, the olives are harvested, the ships go out and return, the tithes are sent to the mainland, the gods are honored. The world feels eternal, fixed, as solid as the Cyclopean walls of Mycenae itself. But across the sea, in the gilded halls of the powerful, tectonic plates of ambition are shifting. A message arrives, carried by a fast ship from the mainland, its sail a speck of white against the blue. It is a summons. From Agamemnon, the High King at Mycenae, the one they all answer to. The story told in the villages is one of passion and insult. Helen, the wife of Agamemnon's brother, Menelaus of Sparta, has been taken, stolen away by a Trojan prince named Paris. An oath must be honored, a grave insult avenged. 1,000 ships will be launched. But Odysseus, in the quiet of his Megaron, knows that stories are cloaks for harder truths. Troy, or Wilusa, as the great Hittite empire to the east calls it, is a city of immense strategic importance. It sits at the mouth of the Dardanelles, controlling the trade route to the Black Sea, to the grain and gold and timber of the north. For decades, the archives of the Hittites speak of tensions between them and the aggressive sea raiders from the west, the Ahiyawa, the Achaeans. This isn't just about a woman, no matter how beautiful. This is about power, about control of the sea lanes, about bronze. Odysseus doesn't want to go. This is a game for the great kings, for men who command vast armies and dream of empires. He is a small island chieftain. His place is here, with his wife, with his infant son. His duty is to his own oikos, but a summons from Mycenae is not a request. It is a command. To refuse is to invite destruction. Agamemnon's power is absolute, so he gathers his men, not an army, but the fighting men of Ithaca and its neighboring islands. Farmers, fishermen, sailors, they fill a handful of ships, the black-hulled, single-masted galleys of the age. He stands on the shore, the salt spray on his face. He looks at Penelope, holding Telemachus. The child's hand is wrapped around his finger. Imagine that moment, the weight of a choice that is not a choice, the fear of a war he cannot avoid, the tearing away from everything that defines him. He makes a promise to his wife, a promise to return. It is a promise he intends to keep, but he has no idea what world he will be returning to. He has no idea that the solid, eternal civilization of bronze and sunlight he is leaving behind is already beginning to fracture, that he and his men are sailing toward not just a war, but an apocalypse. Part 2. The 10-year funeral. The beach before Troy was not a place of glory. It was a city of tents and ships, 10 years deep in mud and blood. The war was not a series of noble duels between heroes. It was a grinding siege, a slow, festering wound. Summers of choking dust, winters of freezing rain. Disease ran rampant through the camp, dysentery, fever. the kind of sickness that rots an army from the inside out. Odysseus was not the star of this brutal theatre. He was not Achilles, the demigod of rage and violence, a killing machine in shining bronze. He was not Ajax, a walking mountain of muscle and bone. He was the man they sent when a spear was not the answer. When the Achaeans needed to negotiate a truce, they sent Odysseus. When they needed to send spies into the heavily fortified city to glean some scrap of intelligence, they sent Odysseus. When morale was collapsing and the men were ready to abandon the whole miserable enterprise, it was Odysseus who stood before the assembly, his voice weaving arguments of shame and duty and the promise of plunder, holding the fragile alliance together with words. He was a survivor. While other, greater men fell to Trojan spears or their own pride, he endured. He watched the seasons turn over the alien landscape of Anatolia. He learned the rhythm of the siege, the grim calculus of attrition. He saw his own men, the boys who had left Ithaca as fishermen and farmers, harden into veterans or die in the dirt far from home. The war hollowed him out, scraped away the chieftain and left the strategist. The city of Troy, or Wilusa, as its allies called it, was a formidable fortress. Its high stone walls, visible from the Achaean camp, were a constant symbol of defiance. Inside, a proud people held on, their king, Priam, refusing to bend. The Trojan War, as Hittite records from their capital Hattusa would later hint, was the culmination of a long-running dispute over this land, a proxy war between the Hittite Empire and the expansionist Achaeans. Odysseus and his men were just pawns on a much larger board. After a decade, something had to break. The story the poets would later sing is one of a magnificent trick, a hollow wooden horse, a piece of brilliant deception, a classic Odyssean stratagem. The historical reality was likely something less elegant, but just as final. Perhaps it was a traitor opening a gate. Perhaps it was a section of the wall weakened by an earthquake, a common occurrence in this region that was finally breached. However it happened, the end was savage. Imagine the sounds of that night. Not the clean clash of swords, but the splintering of doors, the screams from within houses, the roar of fire. Archaeological digs at the site, at the mound called Hisarlik, tell the story the poets leave out. In the layer we call Troy 7a, the layer corresponding to this time, there is a thick stratum of ash and rubble, evidence of a massive conflagration. Among the ruins, archaeologists have found arrowheads, sling bullets, and the unburied skeletons of those who fell in the streets or in their homes. This was not a heroic victory. It was a slaughter, an extermination. Odysseus was part of it. He and his remaining men, fueled by a decade of rage and frustration, poured into the city. They killed, they looted, they dragged away what little they could carry: gold, textiles, women. It was the brutal, accepted practice of Bronze Age warfare, the cost of victory. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins, a grim silence fell. The Achaeans stood victorious, but they were not triumphant. They were exhausted, traumatized, and sick for home. They had won. They had filled their ships with plunder. Now, they could finally leave. They pushed their black-hulled ships off the bloody beach and raised their sails. The mood was one of weary relief. The winds were favorable. The coast of Anatolia shrank behind them. Ahead lay the Aegean, the familiar islands, the journey back to their own world, back to wives and children they barely remembered. But the world had not been waiting for them. While they had been locked in their decade-long struggle, the foundations of their civilization had been cracking. The signs were there, for those who knew how to read them. Strange weather patterns, a persistent haze in the sky from distant volcanic eruptions that dimmed the sun and cooled the summers. Rumors passed from ship to ship of crop failures, of famine, of cities on other coasts that had been found abandoned, their people vanished. They didn't see it. They were sailors focused on the wind and the waves. And then the storm hit. It came from nowhere, a monster of wind and water, a rage that didn't feel natural. This wasn't the anger of a sea god. This was the planet itself groaning in torment. Modern science tells us that the period around 1200 BC was one of intense climate volatility, the driest period of the Bronze Age, prone to mega droughts and, paradoxically, extreme storms. For the men in the ships, it was the end of the world. The sky turned a bruised purple-black. The waves rose like moving mountains, lifting their small ships and casting them down into troughs of churning foam. Masts snapped with a sound like rifle shots. Sails were ripped to shreds. Oars were splintered. Men were washed overboard, their screams swallowed by the howl of the wind. Odysseus's small flotilla was scattered, tossed like leaves in the gale. Ships that had survived 10 years of war were devoured by the sea in a single night. He fought to keep his own vessel afloat, his hands raw from the ropes, his voice hoarse from shouting orders that no one could hear. When the storm finally passed, his ship was alone. The rest were gone. The sky was a strange, unsettling yellow. The sun was a pale disk, and there was no land in sight. Not a single familiar landmark. They were lost. Utterly, terrifyingly lost. Blown off course, pushed south and west, into a sea they did not know. The journey home had ended. A new journey, one through a world that was falling apart, had just begun. Part 3. The Unraveling. There are no accurate maps for a collapsing world. For Odysseus and his surviving crew, every sunrise revealed the same empty horizon. Their food ran low, their water turned foul, the sun beat down relentlessly. They were sailors without a sky, men without a country, adrift in a terrifying new reality. Their first landfall was a deliverance, or so it seemed. A coast of white sand and lush, strange vegetation, perhaps in North Africa. The natives were not hostile. They were gentle, smiling, and strangely lethargic. They shared their food, including the fruit of a flowering plant that grew in abundance. A lotus, or perhaps an opium poppy. For the starving, traumatized sailors, it was a paradise. The plant brought a blissful calm, a warm tide that washed away the memories of war, the fear of the sea, the ache of longing for home. It erased their purpose. Why sail on? Why face the struggle and the terror? Why not just stay here in the warm sun and forget? Odysseus saw what was happening. He saw his men, his comrades who had survived Troy, sinking into a vacant, dreamlike state. Their eyes were glazed. They no longer spoke of Ithaca. He had to force them back to the ship, physically dragging them away from the narcotic peace they craved. They fought him. They wept. They begged to be left behind. It was his first lesson in this new world. The greatest dangers were not monsters of tooth and claw, but the seductive whispers that made you forget who you were. They sailed on, their desperation growing. They needed food, water, supplies. They put ashore on a large, rugged island, maybe Sicily, maybe southern Italy. The land seemed empty at first, a place of high pastures and deep caves. Here, they encountered tribes living a more primitive existence, people who had perhaps never been part of the Great Bronze Age network, or who had been cut off from it. They lived in crude, single-room dwellings, some built into the mouths of caves, dwellings with one opening, one dark central eye that served as both door and window. The encounter turned hostile. Looking for food, they stumbled into the territory of a local chieftain, a huge, brutish man who ruled his clan with savage force. They were trapped, taken prisoner. This was not a monster from myth. This was a man, driven by the brutal logic of scarcity and survival. He saw Odysseus's men not as guests, but as resources, food, slaves. To escape, Odysseus had to rely on his old, familiar tool, his mind. There was no room for honor, no rules of engagement. He waited until the chieftain and his guards were deep in a drunken sleep, fueled by the strong, unwatered wine Odysseus had offered them. Then, in the dark of the cave, he and his men staged a swift, vicious raid. They didn't have a giant to fight. They had a man to neutralize. They took a sharpened stake, heated its tip in the fire, and drove it into the sleeping chieftain's face. It was a blinding, an act of horrific tactical violence. In the chaos that followed, they made their escape, clinging to the bellies of the chieftain's sheep as they were driven out to pasture at dawn. They were free, but they were changed. They had not outwitted a monster. They had committed a desperate, ugly act to survive. The line between hero and butcher was becoming very thin. Their journey continued, a grim series of episodes, each landfall bringing a new danger. They were becoming wraiths, haunting the edges of a world they no longer recognized. Finally, they came to a port that felt like a relic of the world they'd lost. A sophisticated harbor, perhaps a Phoenician trading outpost, ruled by a powerful, shrewd queen. She was beautiful, charming, and her hospitality was legendary. She offered them baths, clean clothes, fine food, and wine that sang in the blood. She seemed like a goddess, a savior. Her name might have been Circe, but her kindness was a carefully constructed trap. Her magic was not supernatural, it was economic. She offered them credit for repairs to their ship, for supplies. She ensnared them in debts they could never repay. She offered them pleasures that dulled their will to leave. Her palace was a gilded cage, and she had a collection of shipwrecked crews, men who were now her indentured servants, her slaves. She turned men into swine not with a wand, but with contracts and addiction. Odysseus, ever the negotiator, the reader of fine print, saw the trap. He spent a year there, locked in a battle of wits with this formidable woman, slowly, painstakingly negotiating his crew's freedom. It was during this time, trading stories with other sailors in the port, that he finally learned the full, devastating truth. The news came in fragments, in whispers from merchants who had seen it with their own eyes. The world they had left was gone. A wave of destruction had swept through the Aegean. The great palace at Pylos, with its priceless clay archives, had been burned to the ground. Tiryns, another mighty fortress, had fallen. And Mycenae, even Mycenae of the Lion Gate, the heart of the Achaean world, had been sacked and burned, its walls toppled by what the geologists would call an earthquake storm, a series of catastrophic tremors that shook the entire region. All systems collapse, a perfect storm of disasters. Mega-drought had led to famine. Famine had led to mass migrations, desperate people taking to the sea in search of food, the so-called sea peoples who raided the coasts of Egypt and the Levant. The earthquakes had shattered the infrastructure, and the intricate trade network that supplied the tin and copper needed for bronze, the very foundation of their civilization, had been severed. The Bronze Age was over. This was the true horror, the revelation that dwarfed every monster and every hardship they had faced. Odysseus was not simply a soldier trying to get home from a war. He was a ghost, a relic of a dead civilization. The kingdom he served, the entire political structure he belonged to, had ceased to exist. He was sailing back to an island that was now completely, utterly on its own, a tiny speck in a new, dark age. The desire to get home was no longer about returning to a life of comfort and authority. It was a primal, desperate need to find the one last thing in the universe that might still be real. His home, his wife, his son. Part 4. The King of Scars. The rest of the journey is a fever dream of loss. The negotiation with the foreign queen had won their freedom, but the sea was not done with them. They faced pirates who lured ships toward dangerous reefs with songs and promises of safe harbor, only to plunder them when they wrecked. They navigated treacherous straits where unpredictable currents could smash a ship against the rocks like a child's toy. They endured hunger, thirst, and the slow, creeping despair that kills more surely than any storm. One by one, the last of his men were taken. A sudden squall claimed a few. A fever took another. A skirmish with hostile natives on a barren shore took the rest, until, at last, there was only him. Alone on a makeshift raft, the sole survivor of the ships that had sailed so proudly from Troy. The sea finally took him too, smashing his raft to pieces and casting him into the waves. But it didn't kill him. It delivered him. It threw him, bruised and broken, onto the rocky shore of his own island, Ithaca. He stood up, the unfamiliar sun of home on his changed face, and began to walk. The land was the same, yet different. The paths were more overgrown. The fields seemed less tended. There was an air of neglect, of anxiety. The tight, ordered world he had left behind had frayed at the edges. He was a stranger here. 20 years had passed. The Trojan War, the wandering, a lifetime. He was no longer the vigorous young chieftain who had sailed away. His hair was streaked with grey. His face was a mask of sun-baked leather, carved with lines of hardship. His body was corded with the muscle of a labourer, not a king, and crisscrossed with scars. No one would recognize him. He was a ghost in his own home. He sought out a loyal old servant, a swineherd who lived in the hills, a man who would not judge him by his rags. And from this man, he learned the state of his kingdom, his oikos. The news confirmed his worst fears. The collapse of Mycenaean power had created a vacuum. Without the central authority of the great kings to keep order, a new kind of power struggle had begun. It was the age of the local strongman, the petty chief. On Ithaca, a pack of them had descended on his estate. They were the sons of other local leaders, ambitious, arrogant men who saw his long absence as an opportunity. They called themselves suitors for Penelope's hand, but it was not a courtship. It was an invasion, a siege. By marrying his wife, one of them could legally claim his lands, his title, his entire household. So they had installed themselves in his hall, in the great Megaron, and for years they had been slowly devouring it, feasting on his livestock, drinking his wine, intimidating his servants, and pressuring Penelope to choose one of them, to declare her husband dead and remarry. Penelope had held them off with the same cunning he himself possessed. The famous story of the shroud she wove by day and unwove by night. Perhaps it was more than just a trick. Perhaps it was a symbol of her struggle to maintain the productive work of the household, the weaving, the creation of value in the face of their parasitic consumption, to literally keep the home from unraveling while they tried to tear it apart. Odysseus listened, a cold, still fury building inside him. These men were the vultures of the new dark age, picking at the bones of the old world. They were everything he despised: lazy, dishonorable, destructive. He returned to his own home, disguised as a beggar. He saw it with his own eyes. The loud, boorish men lounging in his hall, throwing food, manhandling his servants. He saw his son, Telemachus, now a young man of 20, chafing with impotent rage, unable to expel them. And he saw Penelope, her face etched with a quiet, resilient grief, fending them off with her dignity and her wits. The climax was not going to be a battle of armies. It was going to be an extermination, a piece of brutal housekeeping. He revealed himself to Telemachus, father and son, strangers to each other, united by a singular, bloody purpose. With a few loyal servants, they planned it. They waited for the day of a feast, when all the suitors would be gathered in the Megaron, drunk and complacent. They removed all the weapons that normally hung on the walls. They secured the doors. And then he revealed himself. Imagine the scene. The beggar in the corner throws off his rags, and there stands Odysseus. Not a king in shining armor, but something far more terrifying. A figure of pure retribution, his eyes holding the horrors of 20 years. He held a great bow, one he alone had the strength to string. What followed was not a noble fight. It was a slaughterhouse. He and Telemachus and their 2 servants against over 100 men. They barred the doors. the hall became a kill box. Arrows flew, finding their marks not by divine aid, but by the skill of a man who had lived by his bow. When the arrows were gone, they used spears, swords, axes they had hidden. They used overturned tables as shields. It was close, suffocating, butcher's work. The air filled with screams, with the smell of blood and spilled wine. One by one, the suitors fell. They died in the hall they had profaned, choking on the food and wine they had stolen. It was the savage justice of a world without laws, the desperate, violent act of a man reclaiming the last piece of his identity, the last piece of his world. When it was over, silence fell. Odysseus stood in the center of his megaron, ankle-deep in the wreckage, covered in the blood of his rivals. He was at last home. He was at last king again. Part 5. The Echo in the Ruins. The reunion with Penelope was not a fairy tale embrace. How could it be? They were strangers separated by 2 decades of entirely different lives. He was a man shaped by war and chaos. She was a woman shaped by siege and solitude. They had to learn each other again, to find the people they once were inside the scarred adults they had become. They had to rebuild not just their home, but their lives, in a world that was darker and less certain than the one they had known. Odysseus, the man of flesh and blood, lived out his days on his small island kingdom. He ruled over a world without grand palaces or international trade. Life was smaller, more local, more dangerous. The great Bronze Age civilization was a memory. The art of writing itself, the Linear B script of the palace scribes, was forgotten for centuries. An age of darkness had fallen over Greece. But in the long nights of that dark age, around the hearths in small villages, a story was told. It was the story of the chieftain who had gone to the great war at Troy, the one who had survived when all the other great kings had met tragic ends, the one who had journeyed through a world of monsters and temptations, who had seen the land of the dead and who had returned against all odds to reclaim his home. With each telling, the story grew. The facts of his journey, filtered through generations of oral tradition, were woven together with older folk tales, the deep-sea yarns of sailors, stories of cannibals and sorceresses. The brutish cave-dwelling chieftain became a one-eyed giant, a cyclops. The shrewd Phoenician queen became a powerful witch, Circe, who could turn men into animals. The desperate struggle for survival became a heroic epic. The man became a myth. Centuries passed. The darkness began to lift. Writing returned to Greece, this time using an alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians. And around the 8th century BC, a poet, or perhaps a school of poets whom we call Homer, gathered these oral traditions and wove them into a masterpiece. The Odyssey was written down. The man was immortalized as a legend. Back on Ithaca, the memory of their ancestral king never faded. Long after his death, on the very terraces at Agios Athanasios, where his hall once stood, the people of the island built a shrine. Archaeologists have found the evidence: roof tiles, stamped in Greek letters for pilgrims to see. One reads, "Of Odysseus," another reads, "To Odysseus." They found offerings and a small bronze bust of a bearded man. They came here to honor him, the hero who had founded their community, the symbol of their endurance. The man of flesh and blood was gone, buried under layers of soil and centuries of song. In his place stood a legend, a story to guide people through the dark, a reminder that even when the world collapses, the most perilous journey is the one that leads back home. But what do we do when the home we knew is no longer there? If you enjoyed our retelling of the Odyssey, with Odysseus as the man, not the myth, we share more stories like this, stories that explore the moments that shaped our past. Subscribe and we'll continue the journey together.